Currently, the only regulation in this area, and clearly insufficient, I might add, is that the operator must disclose how much they will charge, so that when you access an ATM and you want access and get a thing, it has to tell you how much they're charging you, and you can refuse to do that if you want. But this nominal disclosure requirement does nothing to ensure that the charges are not arbitrary ways for banks and third-party owners of these machines to make an unreasonable sum on the backs of consumers. Now, some of my colleagues may remember that until 1996, most processing networks actually prohibited the operators of ATMs from adding an additional surcharge for the use of the ATMs. Instead, to cover the cost of the transactions, banks paid fees that passed between the consumer's banks, the ATM operating bank, and the card network. That fee of about 50 cents still changes hands today to cover the cost of processing. Now, simply put, by charging consumers these fees while collecting fees from other banks, these big banks are double dipping on the backs of consumers. My amendment would end that double dipping. Enticed by the prospect of easy money in 1996, the rules that prevented banks from charging consumers were overturned by the big card networks, Visa and MasterCard, and the big banks. For this reason, in 1997, I was a co-sponsor, along with Chairman Dodd and others, of a measure introduced by then Banking Committee Chairman D'Amato that would have required the card networks to restore these rules and charge nothing for ATMs. Nothing. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in that effort, but it was bipartisan. Chairman D'Amato was a Republican. Now, as a result, because we were unsuccessful in 1997, the amount of fees that consumers pay has skyrocketed. Now, according to estimates by the Federal Reserve, the average surcharge fee paid by consumers for accessing their own money is $2.66. As I said, in some cases, in airports and other places, it's as much as $5. That's to access your own money. That doesn't seem right to me, and it doesn't seem right to a lot of consumers. It's unfair for people to pay that much to access their own cash. If ATM operators want to charge a fee to cover the cost of providing a service, I can understand that. But that fee needs to relate to what it actually costs to process the transaction, not just the maximum that they think they can get away with. To ensure that these fees are reasonable and relate to the costs of processing the transaction, my amendment would require the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to ensure that fees charged to consumers at ATMs bear a reasonable relation to the cost of processing the transaction. The best data available suggests that the cost of processing a transaction today, you ready for this? 36 cents. Think about that. The next time you go to the ATM, you got to get some cash out, and it comes up and says we're charging you $2.50. The real cost of that, about 36 cents. Where does the rest of the money go? The rest of the money goes to the big banks and the big card networks, and they're making a fortune off of this. Now, we got that data from a survey conducted by the Office of Thrift Supervision, which suggested in 1997, at the time we had our amendment, that the cost of processing a transaction was only 27 cents. 27 cents. So what we did is we factored in inflation. That would bring the cost to about 36 cents today. Now, that assumes that any improvements in technology has not brought down costs, which obviously they have. We have new technologies, faster speed networks, probably has brought the cost down. So when I say that the cost of you going to an ATM machine to access your money is 36 cents, that's on the high side. That's on the high side. So what our amendment basically says is that they could set up a reasonable charge based upon what the costs are, but we put an upper limit. We say no more than 50 cents per transaction. So our amendment would basically say that anytime you go to your ATM machine, they have to charge you a reasonable fee based upon what would be set, but no case more than 50 cents. No case more than 50 cents. Well, again, I just point out, Mr. President, until 2002, in my state of Iowa, the law required that any bank establishing an ATM had to make that available at no cost, no fee to all users. So Iowans were not charged any fees at all, and Iowa banks did fine under this arrangement. Iowa consumers were protected from unfair fees. But in 2002, this reasonable Iowa law was preempted by federal banking regulators. Federal banking regulators preempted this. Now, again, as I have pointed out, in the absence of these state laws, the federal banking regulators have taken no action to limit the amount of fees that consumers can be charged. According to the New Rules Project, national banks, these big banks, collected almost $5 million in ATM fees from Iowa consumers in revenue in the first 6 months. The Iowa Credit Union's data said that it was about $10 million just in the first year. Well, you add that up, that can come to a lot of money. Well, anyway, I bring this example of how things were in Iowa before 2002 because it's a kind of a balance that the bill that is pending before us should restore. Quite frankly, things have tipped so far in favor of big banks in this country and so far away from consumers, we often don't even know what a reasonable balance looks like anymore. But the example of Iowa from several years ago in which consumers were protected from unfair ATM fees while banks still profited is an example, I think an excellent example of the balance that we need to return to. So this broader bill that Senator Dodd has brought forward, Senator Shelby brought forward, isn't anti-business, it's not anti-bank, but it does seek to return us to a situation in which the needs of consumers and the rights of businesses are considered alongside one another. Restore some balance for consumers in our society. And so when I looked at this bill, I thought, well, there is one area that kind of seemed to get overlooked. I suppose a lot of people would say, well, $2, not much. Well, here's the other unfair thing about it. The average person going to an ATM machine probably takes out $20, $50 to get them through a day or a couple, 3 or 4 days in the week. And they're charged $2.50 for accessing that $20 or $50. Someone else goes in there and wants to get $500, they're charged the same $2.50. So the burden falls more heavily on low-income people, moderate-income people who need to use the ATM machines to get some cash to get them through. That is grossly unfair. So it's unfair that the banks and the ATM operators can charge whatever they want to charge. When I pointed out that according to the Office of Thrift Supervision, the data they collected, the average cost of this transaction of processing an ATM is only 36 cents. Why are you being charged $2.50 or $3 or as much as $5? Well, that's what this amendment seeks to stop. Again, to get this balance back where it should be. And my amendment is also supported by the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, the Consumer Federation of America, Consumer Action, Consumers Union, and the National Consumer Law Center on behalf of its low-income clients. So I just want to close by thanking my colleague, Senator Dodd, for his tireless work to move this critical bill forward and to help try to, again, to establish that balance in our country between our consumers, our depositors, our community banks, the big banks, to try to get a balance back. And as I said, we've gotten so far off track, we hardly recognize what a balance is any longer. I think this bill does a great thing in trying to restore that balance. I just want to make sure that consumers are no longer taken advantage of by these unfair ATM fees that are out there. And that's why I'm offering this amendment at the appropriate time, Mr. President.